Right. I shall get cracking then. If any more stragglers come on through, they'll miss us. But look, guys, thank you for everyone that's come along to. I think this is our 5th or 6th sort of webinar we've done since the start of lockdown. So thank you for sparing the time. A bit about TekCurious for those of you that have not been to it. So set up by us here at People Talent. It's really just a forum we build for technology professionals in the Southwest to share knowledge with each other, but in an environment where there's no sales pitch. We don't start pitching about recruitment as much as we'd love to, but we don't. We just facilitate getting sort of a couple of really good speakers to come along and talk about sort of some topics that are relatable to what's happening out there. And Chad and I were sort of wanting to do something around this topic because, I'm sure all of you know, sort of recruiters talk a lot about culture, and obviously businesses do as well, and it being important. But I think with all the changes we've seen over the past few months about having remote teams, clearly Chad and I know loads on the topic, but we thought we'd better let someone else talk about it who probably knows a little bit more than Chad and I. So Chad was chatting to Rob, and Rob suggested sort of him and Abigail coming along to talk for us. So I'll let them sort of get on, but as a brief introduction, Rob's an IT director for a firm based here in the Southwest, and Abigail, sort of an organisational development director who's just completed a MSc in Occupational Psychology as well. So there's some really interesting things that they're both going to talk about. But the format for today is Chad and I are going to keep nice and quiet. Rob is going to sort of tee up some questions for Abigail and then sort of chip in with his views and opinions on them. And at the end of it should be, give or take, 20 minutes. At the end of it then, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. If you look down towards the bottom of the screen, there's a little Q&A tab. Feel free to type in the questions there as we're going through, and then Chad will pick them up at the end and then sort of facilitate that at the end of it. But if you need anything in the meantime, there's a chat feature, or like I said, pop it in the Q&A. But without further ado, I'll be quiet and I'll hand over to Rob and Abigail. So thanks, guys.
Okay, great, thanks Carl, and good afternoon everyone. As Carl said, my name is Rob Fletcher. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction. Well, thanks very much for joining this afternoon. It's really good to see so many people take the time out. And as Carl and Chad said, this is a discussion about culture and psychological safety. It's going to take about 20 minutes. And just so you know, I've worked as an IT leader for about 20 years. Okay, 29 years. You know, I've given my age away. Now, as we all get used to working remotely, what does this mean to organisational culture? We're remotely recruiting staff. We may never actually meet some of our colleagues. So is this the end of culture as we know it, or are we simply in a state of transition? And how do we go about ensuring our colleagues feel like they're fully included and fully empowered to perform and innovate? So we're extremely lucky to have Abigail with us today, who's an occupational psychologist expert, having recently achieved an MSc on the subject at University West of England. So Abigail's going to share her thoughts and insights with us, and I'll try and create some key practical takeaways for us to take back to the office, or take back to our next Teams or Zoom meetings at the very least. So Abigail, we hear a lot about the importance of culture. So what is culture, and is it important? Is it always important, particularly with remote workforces in mind?
Thanks. I'm a bit nervous now. I've been set up as an expert, but hopefully I've got some insight into it. I think the key thing when we think about culture is to remember that we're basically quite social animals. You know, it's back in our evolution that we kind of lived in tribes, and obviously that follows through to our families. And therefore, we're actually really hardwired to want to construct and then seek to adhere to kind of norms in those groups. And that's ultimately what culture is. So it's really deeply embedded in who we are. So anybody who sort of thinks that it doesn't apply somehow, it's like sort of saying, well, you're not going to be human. And there's somebody called Edgar Schein, who if you Google and you've done anything to do with culture, he seems to have written everything on it. But he basically, and I quite like his thing, is because he's basically this pattern of basic assumptions that a group develops just in order to deal with problems that they've kind of decided actually works quite well. You know, it works well, and therefore they kind of teach it to new members. So if we think about it like that, it's basically, you know, they are our underlying assumptions, and therefore that's our default setting in a group. You know, that's how we should behave. Otherwise, we might find ourselves excluded from that group. And I think that's the key bit. You know, nobody really wants to be excluded from a group they value. So I think it also acts as our moral compass. So, you know, we will behave in a certain way if we're being watched by someone, but actually when nobody's around, we will default to, you know, those basic underlying rules, often not even necessarily that consciously, particularly because people really don't want to deviate from stuff that they value, so they don't want to be evicted from that group. So I think a big question is, you know, does your culture that's actually happening in between people actually match up with what you're saying it is? So if you've got, you know, your posters on everything, you know, people will do what they're rewarded for doing, basically. So if you've got behavioural issues and you're saying, you know, people don't innovate, they do this, do that, that is because that is how they have been rewarded in the past. So sometimes as senior managers, we always want to sort of point at, you know, them down there as being the problem, but ultimately it's us that are rewarding those behaviours sometimes. So if over time you've got it where, you know, employees have actually received even sort of slightly negative feedback in terms of making a suggestion or doing something outside of policy, they will store and pass it on to their colleagues that that's not how we do things around here. And eventually, and quite quickly, they will stop doing it. So that's really why culture is such a big deal when it comes to, you know, digital transformation. If you read Harvard Business Review, it's everywhere now. You know, people will not do the whole fail fast thing. If last time they failed in any way, or even one of their colleagues or their colleague's colleague failed, it didn't go down well, people learn really quickly. So I think that also raises a really valid point around culture can be a really bad thing in some respects, because if you've got the wrong culture, you get people with the right behaviours coming in, they will assimilate to whatever the culture actually is under the surface. That doesn't mean, you know, that you can do away with culture, but I think it's just being really aware of that. So culture is there whether you like it or not, and it will be there whether, you know, you're remote or otherwise if you're working with other people.
Okay, so what you're saying there is culture is not just going to evaporate because we have a remote workforce. If anything, it's just going to change in its nature and change in its dimension. What you're saying also is, you know, it's one thing having stated culture, but it's making sure all the behaviours from the leadership teams within those organisations actually align and underpin and support the culture you're looking to achieve. Because I think what you're alluding to is if you have a culture that says one thing, but then leaders that completely behave in the opposite direction, then it's the behaviours gazump the culture, because people will see those behaviours and align to those new norms within the group, which may be at odds with what you're trying to achieve in the culture. What's interesting is your point about, so if digital transformation or any sort of technology change, I'm just conscious that a lot of the audience here will be probably technologists at heart. So if we're talking about digital transformation or any sort of technology change, actually a good place to start is a hard look at the organisational culture and its current ability to support the correct behaviours, to make sure that the behaviours and culture is actually, they mirror each other. And you're also saying the culture needs to be seen to reward change performance, both in words and in practice. So the posters could be saying one thing, but leadership behaviours could be contradictory to the culture that you're trying to cultivate.
Yeah.
So a good question for attendees to maybe ask themselves is, you know, do you really know your organisational culture? Do the words and the music match? The word and the music match? And then really be honest about that assessment. And are people with strong opinions, those change evangelists, those people with ideas about how the organisation can be better, are they genuinely embraced as seen as part of the solution or part of the problem?
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, I think that's quite interesting, because we've kind of gone from this kind of subject matter, which is a broad definition of culture at an organisational level, and then we're starting to orientate the conversation around the individual, because surely a lot comes down to the individual, you know, their skills and their attitude. For example, in my experience, some individuals seem to be better at doing the right things, better at bringing the desired organisational culture to life, despite others. So can you talk to us about the role of the individual in terms of achieving culture?
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, we are social animals, so actually a lot of our values come from exactly the same place. So we've learnt values growing up from our parents, you know, what we got rewarded for, what we didn't. And again, we don't, you know, so those are really deeply embedded, and it is what worked well for us in the past. So if being supportive of others and actually being considerate of others was a key value in your youth, you will have those values embedded in you, and really quite deeply embedded. And that's why actually shifting from that is actually really, it's a real stress for people. And often that is quite unconscious. People don't necessarily think about these things. It is just how they are. I think that's a key part of how your personality is formed. And that's why, value-based recruiting is so important, because obviously you're effectively, if you get it right, you're hiring somebody who's pre-tuned to the culture that you're looking for, because people will toe the line in an organisation to a point, but often when they're being watched. And therefore, if the overriding culture is different to that, then they will revert back to whatever that may be, which obviously not always that helpful. But obviously, if you're recruiting to certain values because you think that's your espoused culture, but your actual culture underneath isn't that, you will end up with issues again, because you get somebody in who's maybe, you're getting somebody who is very innovative, or wants to be challenging, or is very has high integrity. If your culture doesn't actually fit with that, you will find, that you mentioned a minute ago when we were off screen about cognitive dissonance, which is basically a posh way of saying that actually your values are kind of at odds. So your values are one thing, but you also want to be part of the culture in this organisation, and the two are at odds. And that's often where an awful lot of stress and issues come from. And effectively what you'll end up with is the people who thrive in organisations are the ones who actually align with the actual culture. So if your culture is all about stabbing people in the back and getting one over on each other, those are the people who will actually thrive. The people that you've recruited, because they're the values you really want, will end up, getting stressed, turnover, they'll leave. So we need to understand those individual needs. So we can use it to our advantage, but trying to change a culture one individual at a time, unless they're very strong people, will not really work. You'll just find you'll have workplaces where you'll just see people turn up, they're brilliant, and then they burn out and go. That's normally a warning sign that something's gone awry somewhere. And people do have very different needs, and I think we all know this, but it's very difficult sometimes to see it from different perspectives. And I think some people are very keen to maintain harmony and find conflict stressful, and all of these things will come out more when we're doing things remotely, because again, we're quite good, really, most of us, at picking up hints when we're face to face with people all the time that they're not happy, and not everyone will certainly speak up and say anything. So I think and it is very much that one man's poison is another one's reward, really. It's about understanding that different people, so some people thrive on having autonomy and really like that, and that's part of again, that's their deep underneath values of what's worked for them well in the past. If, however, somebody's really thriving on relatedness and belonging and supporting other people, actually working remotely is going to be much harder for them. So it's and those people are likely to deal worse with conflict. So I think one of the things I've reflected on really is, how you deal with conflict within a team will be really key to managing remotely like this, because not everyone will speak up and say that they've got an issue. But just because people aren't saying they haven't got an issue doesn't mean that they're not actually really quite impacted by it. And some people just find conflict in itself really stressful. So I think it's understanding those sort of issues. And well-being is really inherently tied to that. If you're working against your sort of values and beliefs, that's going to be one of the key triggers for well-being. So again, that's something that we're seeing a lot of in this sort of scenario. And I think this is where we bring in the sort of threat thing. So if we think about it, most of what we consider threatening is actually a challenge to our values or how we like working. So if you're a very people person, you will be more upset by something, to do with fairness or relatedness. Whereas if you're more of an autonomous person, that might go completely over your head. And again, intuitively, we understand that. If you're very competence focused, some people, they actually find it really threatening that they don't, they can't do things. And some organizations have actually, there was an article on TED the other day about saying organizations deliberately recruit people who are quite anxious around competence because they know that those values will drive them. But I guess from a psychological perspective, I would caution against organizations thinking, oh, great, we'll find those, because the other evidence is when we feel threatened, i.e., if we're really keen on our competence, when our competence is questioned, that is a threat to us, if that's important to us. And then when we are threatened, we get more narrow focused, we become blinkered, we become massively less empathetic, we can't read other people, and we become aggressive or passive aggressive, which again is harder to tell online. And we just end up with this, and we become much less able to learn from mistakes and so on. So I think if we understand our own needs and other people's needs, we can then understand that when those needs are threatened, we actually change our approach to other people quite dramatically. Whereas if we're safe and our needs are being met and we kind of feel respected, the evidence is actually that, you know, we become much more empathetic, trusting, you know, creative. So that's where this sort of builds and will, you know, leads into the sort of psychological safety.
Okay, that's great. So kind of what I take from that then is what really struck me there is about different things can stress individuals, and we shouldn't forget actually within our teams and our organisations, we're all individuals, and we all are stressed by different things, and those stress triggers happen when our values or what was happening is at odds with our values. What was also interesting there was this notion of value-based recruitment, which I've heard a lot about recently, this idea that you have a stated organisational culture and you recruit a square peg for a square hole. You know, you recruit people who natively have that match with your organisational culture, but be warned, you bring those people in, that isn't your actual culture, and those people aren't probably going to stick around for very long. I would encourage the audience or the attendees to just Google this term cognitive dissonance, be really aware of it, understand what it is, and be aware of it individually, and also be aware of it in others as well, because I think that's a really interesting term that Abigail's used a lot with me recently, and the more I've learned about it, the more interesting this term cognitive dissonance actually is. Yeah, and the final point I think, which was a powerful one, is when quite often there's people, you know, we can arrive in a state of conflict, and actually just be aware that when people are in conflict, it might not be obvious. So therefore, this idea of a remote workforce is really quite dangerous, because if you're not careful as a leader, you could lose touch with the people around you and not appreciate that these individuals are currently stressed individuals in a high state of conflict. And equally, you might not understand what their stresses are. And the issue with that is that if people aren't speaking up about being unhappy, then these people are likely to be struggling at work, you know, with their performance, their satisfaction, and their engagement. So it's really important as a workforce becomes more remote to make sure as leaders we're really understanding what's happening with our people at an individual level. So moving forward then, I've heard a lot about this term psychological safety. So where does this fit in? What is it? And why is it important? And is it new? Because it's a newish term to me. Psychological.
Yeah, it's not new, and actually the guy I mentioned earlier, Shine, actually first coined it, but it's kind of come to its form more recently with some work by Amy Edmondson, who worked at Harvard. So psychological safety has been kind of identified as a major factor in team effectiveness at Google. People may have read about that in terms of project they called Project Aristotle, and it was the underpinning thing around team effectiveness. Again, work in the 90s identified it as a key measure in terms of employee engagement, and I've just been doing a load of work around high reliability organisations, and those, you know, things that really focus on safety and reliability, it comes to do that as well. So it kind of is a bit all pervasive. And it's really linked to organisational learning and this idea that, you know, in order to learn, organisations need to be able to actually recognise when things go wrong. I noticed somebody was posting about black box thinking. So again, you'll be familiar with this idea that, you know, you need to be able to see what's going on in order to learn. And psychological safety is really where people feel included, that they're safe to learn, safe to contribute, and safe to challenge. And basically they won't be kind of excluded. So you can, again, you see how it fits in with what I was talking about earlier, that they won't be excluded or ridiculed or kind of rejected in any other way. And the reason it works with organisational learning, it's kind of for two reasons, I think. So obviously people need to be able to speak up without fear of looking stupid or upsetting people. So again, you see, you know, you've got the competence thing. Some people who like competence don't want to be looking stupid. People who like other people don't want to upset each other. And so there's different drivers for why people don't speak up. But also, if there is a threat situation, people become much less able to actually see things as well. So this cognitive dissonance idea that you receive threat as feedback as a threat, and you kind of close your ears to it, or you close your eyes to what's going on. So it's the typical story of the Emperor's New Clothes, if you remember that. It's all very much about, people stop being able to see what's going on, and then you end up with this sort of vicious circle. So psychological safety is really about enabling that safe mode that I talked about earlier, rather than that threat mode. But it's not about being soft and fluffy. It's actually, if you read about it, it's very much about, being candid. It's about having a just culture so that people know where they stand. They get the feedback, but it's done in a kind of supportive way in order to help people learn, rather than, we all know that sometimes when people give us feedback, it's actually just a way of point scoring or knocking us down. And we're very attuned, I think, as humans, to be able to intuitively know the difference between those things. So it's about building that kind of culture around safety in the widest sense.
Okay, so to paraphrase all of that, so psychological safety is switching an employee psychology from a position of defensiveness where they're not able to contribute and not able to engage with the business, to a situation where that employee actually feels safe to learn, safe to contribute, and safe to challenge the status quo. And that's important, because then you get your entire workforce, rather than just your leadership team, driving the business forward, innovating and changing things for the better. What we do know is the practitioners themselves, 9 times out of 10, are the best people to be reinventing, rethinking, remodeling their business architecture, because they do the job day in, day out. So psychological safety is so fundamental to success going forward, and particularly complex organizations and innovation. Where do we start? How do we go about building this kind of highly engaged, highly empowered, safe environment, switching from a defensive position to a safe position? Where do we start?
So I think one of the key things to note, which I've kind of emphasised all the way through, is what feels safe will depend on different people as well. So I think that's sometimes a bit lost in the literature. So that's key. But I think the big ticket item is really it's leaders have to play a massive part in this, and it's largely around encouraging voice, enabling people to speak, which sounds like a bit obvious in the circumstances, but it's giving that confidence and permission almost is a key part of it, because people won't take it as read if that's not what's happened in the past. So, and there is that building that orientation towards learning. So again, Amy Edmondson's written a book recently, I think, called The Fearless Organisation, which has got a really good model in there around that. But I think if you read a lot around trust and leadership, predictability is a massive factor. And you can kind of, if you think about it, see the link here. If your leader sometimes is great when you give them feedback and other times is really not, what are you going to learn? You're not going to take the risk. So that's where predictability as a leader comes in. And that's where actually we need to do some of the hard work ourselves as leaders and actually understand our own threats. Because if we get into a position where we feel threatened, we will turn into not a very helpful person, to put it mildly, because actually our ego will get the better of us, and that's where we will start. And we've all been on the receiving end of a leader like this. You give them feedback and it's the shoot the messenger thing. If you shoot one of your messengers once in your organization, that will get through, and that can really damage the relationship. So the more we can address our own kind of threats and understand that and deal with that, and that's where a lot of the mindfulness and all that sort of stuff comes in that we haven't really got time to talk about now. But the more you're able to admit your own faults and mistakes, the more available you become to people and the less threatening. But I think in addition to encouraging voice, there's some other common features around effectiveness that I think sort of support psychological safety, because it kind of puts a framework in place that takes out some of those threats we talked about earlier. And you can see this across a number of the sort of different research. And it also minimises the potential for people to take defensive acts as well. So what's quite threatening is, and again, we've seen it before, is if people feel under threat, they will often just throw a little hand grenade over at someone else just to distract people. And that, again, is massively damaging. And I'm sure we've all been on the receiving end where, somebody just sort of suddenly decides to, suggest that there's a problem in your department rather than theirs. All of that increases threat. So if we can really focus on purpose within teams, and again, people are aware of this, but I think it enables people to meet a basic need around purposefulness, which is, none of us like doing things for a waste of time, but that also limits people's power struggles and political stuff. If you're fighting over purpose, it kind of muddies the water and enables a lot more of this sort of, I say, grenade throwing to go on, really. And it's about focusing on the big picture so that people are actually all focused on achieving, keeping the boat afloat rather than just their bit. So again, I think that aligns people more. Another obvious one to some degree, but it's about dependability and performance management. The more you can say that actually we are going to produce high quality work, and we are going to, be measured by that, it kind of, otherwise you've got this sort of threat for people who don't like conflict and also value competence, because, we've all been in teams where you've done your bit and then someone else doesn't. That's again really threatening. So I think the more we can build a performance management culture and actually address where people aren't being held to account, that is massive. Structure and clarity is another one. Again, we hear a lot now around kind of much more flat structures, and maybe there's a sort of move to not having job descriptions. The issue with that really is that people find not knowing what their roles are actually quite threatening, because again, you might tread on other people's toes, or you might be seen as, there's nothing worse than if you're a real focus on competence and suddenly somebody picks you up for something that you didn't even think was your job. So I think all of the literature from Google right through shows that actually the more you can understand the big picture and how people's roles fit together really helps. Conflict and feedback, enabling management of that, and actually having constructive feedback and encouraging that candor is massive. And then just that wider sense of team. When threat increases, which obviously we have got at the moment with COVID, as I said before, we've become less empathetic and we're particularly tribal. So the them and us thing will come out much more when people are under threat. So I think, a bit of a whistle-stop tour then. But if you Google things like, Google's, it's their own work. So it's Google Project Aristotle. There's quite a good little framework there. And I think that all does underpin psychological safety. So I think if you can put those measures in place in your team, it's about removing some of the innate threat that you might not think about otherwise.
Great, well, thanks for that. So we're talking about psychological safety is about moving the typical threat triggers that we'd find in most organisations, and you went through those from things like having a clear sense of purpose, performance management, structure clarity, having mechanisms to deal with conflict and feedback, and widening out the sense of the team. So we're moving to a psychologically unsafe organisation to a psychologically safe organisation. And what you're saying is leadership in that is critical, particularly this concept of predictable leadership, where you might have an emotional reaction because we are human at the end of the day. Just drawing breath and taking a moment to put that emotional reaction to one side before you respond and react, and actually reacting with measure, compassion, and intellectual foresight. Because the problem is, you're saying, if you respond emotionally in the heat of the moment, that might compromise your predictability as a leader, and therefore put people off taking a risk in the future in front of you or in front of others. Also saying predictability is about trust and transparency as well. And I think in the technology industry, which we all work, it's largely a complex knowledge economy. So, this is what I'm trying to say here is, as technology professionals, we're not transactional in the work we do. It's a highly creative industry where we need to bring our intellectual thought leadership and our skills to the job every day. So what we really need to be nurturing is a liberated workforce, genuinely feel safe to put skin in the game, bring their total self to the job each day, rather than holding things back. Because at the end of the day, IT professionals are really expensive commodities. So it'd be a false economy to have those assets underperforming within the work environment. And the final point before we just round off is, remember that threat, when people are under threat, it changes their behavior. And I paraphrase this as it going from a panoramic 180 degree view of the world, and now I'm under a threat stress reaction, my 180 degrees becomes 5 degrees. I go from panoramic to tunnel vision, which then comes back full circle to the need for your colleagues to have voice. Because if I'm under stress occasionally, I'm going from 180 degrees to 170, I need my colleagues and my associates around me to have voice to mitigate when I'm feeling stressed. And that works both ways. So that's Abigail, it's a really great run for culture, the individual roll around culture, a description of what psychological safety is, and its criticality within contemporary business. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, guys. I'm going to empty it to the floor now. We've got a few questions. As mentioned, I know that there might have been a question in the chat function, but if you can fire any questions that you may have for Abigail or Rob in the Q&A. We'll start with Nick's question, Abigail, or indeed Rob. When you're new into an organisation or perhaps working remotely, what's the best way to pick up on and understand what the internal culture is, especially as we've just said that the real culture often isn't the same as the culture is said to be? It's a good point.
Yeah, I think that is one of the big challenges, and I think that's where ultimately, if you are working remotely, it is very difficult to understand, because it is, they are those underlying assumptions, and I think that's where a leader has to actually do the groundwork with new members. And obviously, if you're the new member of the team and you're not getting that, I think it's about trying to engineer a conversation with hopefully your team leader and maybe some of your colleagues to try and at least elicit some of those key points. And maybe it's about understanding your own needs, because I think quite often it's actually we inevitably feel a bit stressed when we don't know what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So maybe understand what it is that you're feeling a bit anxious about, because some things it won't bother you so much. So if it's speaking up in meetings, or so understand where you're feeling anxious about, whether you know the rules or not, and then maybe focus on a couple of those key things, because just asking people what the culture is like around here probably won't elicit enough depth. But if you start with the things that matter to you, you can probably work out from there. But I think ultimately that's where I say leaders need to engage with that and try and assist people when they're joining the team as much as possible, just to engage and have and the more you engage with each other in a group, you'll get that sense coming through, because we are good at picking it up, as long as we get the time to do it.
I would just add to that by saying the point Abigail made at the start was, when you join a new tribe, let's call an organisation, the team you've just joined as a new starter, let's call it your tribe. Let's roll time back a few thousand years, and we've just joined a tribe. Your first exposure to culture will be the norms and the behaviours within that tribe. And as a new starter to the organisation, you're going to be looking for those clues and those signals and those ways of working within that tribe. And 9 times out of 10, unless you're a real maverick, your propensity is going to be to subscribe to those norms and those behaviours, because I tell you what, you want to stick around, you want to be part of the tribe. So I think for me, the trick is to have great kind of layers of management within organisations. So at the top can agree what the culture of the business is. And it's really important that as you go through the hierarchies of an organisation, everyone's on point, on message. So when these new members of the tribe join your sub-team, you're not ending up accidentally creating what they call a microculture that's standalone, unique to your team. I think you'll always have a degree of microculture and difference at a team-based level. But what you really want is where there's at least 70–80% alignment and congruence with the corporate messaging around what type of culture we want as a business. You're always going to get 20–30% differences, because that's the makeup of the DNA of the people within that team. I would say, look at the tribe you're joining, look at the norms, look at the values systems within that tribe, and as leaders and cascades of management throughout an organisation, make sure that everyone's aligned and trying to implement the same messaging.
Yeah, good point. And I think it's pretty much what John's come up with as well. If you see the second question, as a leader going into an organisation, a new organisation, how do you identify the culture within an organisation? I would suggest it's probably similar as a leader as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's identifying what I think start with, you know, hopefully most organisations these days actually have values that they've written out, and I think you can quite quickly start to assess which ones feel that they actually apply and which ones maybe don't. But as a leader, I think we are duty bound to start having conversations with our own, you know, within the leadership team, where we actually do see that kind of level where it's not congruent, and that, you know, you say, well, we say that, but actually in practice we don't seem to be doing it. So I guess it's a challenge back to say, as leaders, we do need to actually not just look at it as a bit of paper and put it to one side and sort of try and identify. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with asking your team members whether, you know, where you feel the culture does and doesn't fit as well.
Yeah, okay. Ben's put, in terms of recruitment and change of culture, could you talk about your thoughts in terms of, should you be looking for people to fit in with the culture and trying to amend that when they get here, so not to alienate existing team members? Or should we really be shaking up and hiring for what we're trying to become, as opposed to what you actually are? In the latter, what would you be? What would be a good way of assisting team members who might be set in their ways, just new culture?
So I think hiring somebody that doesn't fit at all and not doing anything to address the existing culture will end up probably with an issue, because effectively the whole point of bringing somebody different in is, you know, because you want diversity and you want that challenge. But if you bring someone in who is at odds with the rest of them, and you don't build this psychological safety where people actually feel able to be themselves, all you're actually doing is, you know, unless they're a very strong individual, you will just be setting them up to have quite a, you know, an unpleasant time potentially. So I think it's about, you absolutely want to get to a point where you can bring people in with diverse views, but your culture is about saying, these are our values as an organisation. We respect each other's, you know, that we've got different views, and we are in a safe environment where this, and we will hold each other to account if that's not, you know, if we're not doing what we say we're going to do. But I think it's an iterative journey. I think you kind of can't, I don't think you can just bring in somebody and change the culture without addressing the kind of the wider environment of the organisation at the same time. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of saying that everybody just should fit with a certain type, because obviously then you end up with groupthink and various other issues that don't help either.
Yeah, so Brian's put, it's easy to verbally describe a company culture, but it's rarely written down anywhere. Any tips on putting those spoken words into written words to describe a desired company culture? That's a tough one, that.
I think if you're trying to describe, I mean, I would always advocate, you know, you need to involve the people on the ground. So, you know, we always see where a management team sits down and comes up with a culture, and invariably that's nice, but it doesn't necessarily match. So I think the more you can actually get people to, you know, even if they just do descriptive words, you know, you can do the word cloud. It's amazing, you know, that's where most of the theory on personality actually came from, lots of different descriptions of personality. So I think you can uncover a culture reasonably easily if you want to engage, but you need to engage with teams and ask them what they, you know, a couple of words that describe the culture, or, you know, what's the primary thing. And I think that's how you can get it out. And then you can pull that together to then use it to describe your culture. And that's obviously your culture as it is now. If you then want to shift the culture, you can then sort of look at, okay, what works well, which bits do we want to change, and what does that actually mean? What would that really look like? Because again, you can just pluck out a word and say we're going to be different, but you kind of need to say, well, what do we need to change? Particularly, what are we currently doing that makes us think that that's a good idea that we keep doing that, and therefore we need to remove that kind of reward, because say people tend to do what they've been encouraged to do. So you need to work out what's kind of encouraging that change. That's a long answer, but
I'll just add to that, because I think what just makes me think about this is about COVID, remote workforce and recruitment. Let's just say, for example, some organisations turn over their staff between 10 and 20% of the staff a year. Let's call it 20%. So every 5 years, you're completely churning your entire workforce. And particularly within the tech industry, all I've ever wanted is the best talent. That's the key, is hiring the best talent. When you advertise positions, I've got to be honest with you, even now, you're seeking out the cream of the crop, which is a thin layer of the talent within the entire talent pool. In terms of what we're talking about with culture, just 2 or 3 things strike me. Number one, these days people use systems like Glassdoor to go and understand what the culture of this organisation might be. Now, I know Glassdoor is a bit like TripAdvisor. People only go on there to moan, but that is generally a go. If you're about to take a job, you will go on Glassdoor and you'll see what people are saying about that organisation. The second source of intelligence about organisational culture just comes from word of mouth. People people you're talking to, people who say, you know what, you've got to go and work. If you get an opportunity to go and work for company X, don't pass it by because they're an exemplar company in the region. Yeah, so you've got those sort of 2 sources, and actually the third source of organisations you choose to go and work for is just your own service experience. What was the impression that you got last time you transacted with that organisation? Because the way your service experience will leave you with an impression as to what that organisational culture is like, and therefore you'll be seeking out organisations using those 3 things plus probably loads of other stuff to determine who you want to go and work for. Let's assume that you're the cream of the crop. That's quite important stuff, because this is now connecting organisations up to the best talent in the market. So getting those 3 things right is a clear external story about your organisational culture. And that's a story I think we increasingly need to get right.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of that predictability, could you chat about gaining the trust of team members who have been historically managed by maybe some less predictable leaders and bringing them round to the leader of now and not then?
Yeah. And actually, when you do the research, it's amazing how much, people will literally say about, oh, I don't speak up because, the previous manager here didn't like it. So, and actually, when you just ask people about it, they can kind of recognize it doesn't make sense, but they still do it anyway. So I think trust it kind of comes, switching sort of areas a little bit, but people may have come across somebody called Brené Brown who looks at it more from a sort of social perspective. But she talks about, actually, if you need to be very open with people and, set boundaries and be willing to say no. You need to be reliable. You need to be accountable. You need to live by your values and have integrity. So there are ways of building trust, but it does take time. It's very quick to destroy. So I think you do need to engage with people on a one-to-one basis and build that up. But I think do not expect people to change those underlying. But equally, actually getting people to talk about it and processing it is normally how you can at least surface what might be unconscious. So that person who said that they, wouldn't change their behaviour because of the managers from years ago, if you have that conversation about, well, what is it that makes you not feel confident in speaking up? And if it is something quite irrational or not irrational because it's sensible, but, it doesn't make sense if you look at it from a purely cognitive, rational perspective in modern times and today, then at least you can help people kind of get over it a little bit, because otherwise it is just such an automatic thing that they just do it out of habit. Yeah,
absolutely. Emily's come up with a fair question around the international environment. So in an international environment, you also have different cultures. A Brit might not feel psychologically safe where an American does, because Americans tend to have more direct communication and Brits more indirect. How to build it in a multicultural environment?
Yeah, and I think, and that's, this is where, we say that culture is pervasive, and whilst we don't like stereotypes of cultures, they are there for a reason, because that's, what we have perceived over time. I'm not saying it's a good thing that we stick with them, but we need to be aware that they will exist. But I think the good thing with psychological safety, and certainly the frameworks, is it's about how you build it. So you need to build some resilience, so that actually, if you have got somebody in your team who may or may not be American, who may or may not be brash, then it's sort of being able to look at it and say, well, what is it about that threatens me? and actually how do we work that through? So you get to a point where you're kind of more mutually respecting, I suppose, of different people's positions. We can't expect in an international team that we'll all have the same inherent, backgrounds and values, but I think it's about building that ability to recognize each other's needs and not necessarily always be threatened by them. I make that sound very easy, but I think the more we can kind of try and understand what is it about that, that individual that I find threatening, then we can kind of have those conversations. But I think ultimately it's trying to build a respectful environment where, people can speak up should they want to, and try and build it from there. But it's not an easy thing to do if you have got, very diverse people coming through, but it's definitely worth addressing. I think ignoring it is not going to work.
Good. That's all. Anybody else got any other questions at all? Final wrap up now, or pass over to Carl, who can wrap things up.
Steve Dennis. Steve had a
Yes, Mr. Dennis. So if I can read that out, he's put it on the chat and not the Q&A. Honestly, some people. Sorry, Steve. With a move to, and can you see this question, guys, as well? With a move to a far more remote working environment recently, what cultural changes have you seen developing that have been really good for keeping a team together, productive and valued? I ask as I've recently moved from a less remote, less stable culture to a permanently remote culture. So in other words, he hasn't seen his boss and he's been there 4 months.
Yeah, I can just give you two things that I think made quite a big difference. So pretty much the week lockdown happened. It's a little bit specific. It's about staying in touch and about creating a conduit to enable the entire team virtually and remotely to stay in touch. And we did two things. The first thing we did was just simply schedule a 30-minute Teams meeting, check-in, touchdown, 10 a.m. every day of the week. It was only for 30 minutes. And two things we did. On a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, it was work-related. On a Tuesday and a Thursday, it was more kind of what's going on, and there was a quiz, bit of fun, bit of downtime. But the point is, after each of those sessions, those half-an-hour Teams video sessions, two things then happened for the rest of the day. So the team chat environment persisted for the rest of the day. So people were able to continue communicating digitally through the team chat channel. And actually what also happened is the video channel was persistent. So all that happened is people didn't leave the meeting. They just went on mute. And then when someone wanted to say something to the whole team, they could take themselves off mute and broadcast over video to the entire team. So just using Teams or Zoom is a great tool that could easily be unexploited. Just pin up a session at the beginning of the day, keep it running, because it keeps that team together, keeps it connected. And actually, ironically, I found within the first few weeks of lockdown, I was much more connected to my team remotely than I ever had been when I was in the office. It was incredible.
Yeah, good. Well, guys, thanks for that. I'll pass over to Carl to wrap up things in terms of where we're going to be posting this for future reference if you want to share it. But over to you, Carl. Thanks, Abigail. Thanks, Rob, for answering those questions.
Thanks, Chad.
No worries.
Thanks, Chad. Always helps when I take myself off mute, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Thanks to Rob and Abigail. I think that was really good, and I think it resonated with lots of people. So massively appreciate both of you giving up your time to come along and do it, and all of the time you put in behind the scenes to pull something together that was pretty slick, to be fair. So thank you very much to both of you. And then for those of you who've not been to one of these before, so these sessions are recorded. We will get them up on our website, and then we'll share it along with everybody that's come along today, so you can go and view it via our website. And again, we'll put the contact details via LinkedIn for Rob and Abigail as well. So if you do want to get in contact with them, by all means reach out to them directly. I'm sure they're both happy to answer any questions or share any more pearls of wisdom that they have. So yeah, like I said, we'll follow that up. Couple of things, a bit of a shameless plug for Chad and I. So obviously we do our weekly vlog, but one of the things we're wanting to do is probably sort of alongside our TekCurious sessions are having some sort of interviews on the vlog, and we've got a little podcast as well now. So I think if anybody's either interested in coming along and talking at one of our TekCurious events, or coming along and sort of talking in one of our podcasts or on our vlog, then get in touch. That would be brilliant to discuss that further. But look, again, thank you for all of you guys that come along and watch and listen, because without you, none of this would be possible. So thanks for giving up your afternoon for an hour. But once again, thanks to Rob and Abigail for a really interesting talk. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.